Hello, good evening. Hope you're doing well. I'm Seb, now with a curtain backdrop, and I'm going to be talking about my recent reads. So basically, the books that I read in like the last third or so of 2021. So without further ado, let's begin. I started with Tender is the Flesh by, what was her name? Agustina Bazterrica, translated by Sarah Moses. This is a Argentinian dystopian novel about so it's in the future, near future, and some disease has like killed the animals. But because we want to keep eating meat, we've turned to cannibalism. We, as in like human society. It's set in Argentina, and so and it's sort of following the life of a guy called Marcos, who's he works in the meat industry, and he's kind of like a middleman. He's like a kind of a foreman for like a meat factory or something like that. So he kind of goes between lots of different people who are involved in the industry at different levels, including like the consumers and the factory owners and the factory workers. And like so we get like these little snapshots of the society and how it's changed now that we're all cannibals. So it's got like this interesting mix of two big themes, I think. One of them is the meat industry and like how like that's kind of messed up the whole way that works, the way that we process animals for our consumption. And like you feel the horror of that because obviously the animals are replaced with humans. And also it's got this sort of political thing which seems to be connected to Argentina's history with the military dictatorship stuff, where like you know these horrible things are going on in society, and everyone just has to kind of like act like it's normal, even though deep down kind of there's a sort of moral repugnancy maybe, but we have to kind of push that away to just get on with our lives, when people are being disappeared and murdered all the time by the government. So like yeah, it's pretty heavy, and that's one of the things that made it really like not fun for me. I mean, I don't think it's meant to be a fun book, but it just had no lightness or levity or humor or playfulness or like anything. I mean, at least I didn't pick up on that. It just seemed like very, very serious for a topic which is kind of ridiculous, really. Like the transition, they call it the transition, like the period from when they went from our basic society into their one, of eating people is okay. It's meant to have happened in just like a few years. So like like the main character Marcos, his father, it can get used to the transition. So they have this idea of like the generational gap, between like the older generation who can't get used to the atrocities and so on, and Marcos's generation who's kind of like accepted it as normal. But I found it like impossible to believe in. I probably would have been able to suspend my disbelief if I was really into the characters, or if the ideas were super compelling, or if the atmosphere was incredible. But I didn't like any aspect of this novel, to be honest. Like it was difficult to get through. It was just quite short. So, and I was listening it on the audiobook, and the narrator had a great voice. I found Marcos especially just really dislikable and annoying, and like I think we're meant to feel like kind of sorry for him and his struggle that he's going through between like having to live a normal life while obviously being involved in a terrible system that's doing terrible things, and like kind of playing a very active role in that. Kind of feels like a concentration camp guard perspective, maybe something like that. And like there's a lot of room for interesting moral dilemmas and stuff there, but I just didn't feel that at all with Marcos. Needless to say, it's an incredibly violent and graphic book, which, like I don't have a problem with violence if it's done very well. There's another book on this list which is also very graphically violent, but I thought it was brilliant. Yeah, this one just didn't work for me. So I feel like maybe the shock value was meant to be a big part of it, and I didn't find it shocking. And the initial kind of interesting merging of those two big ideas about like the meat industry and also the political dictatorship stuff, totalitarian nonsense, like mixed with capitalism and all this stuff. Yeah, like it could have worked really well together, I guess, but I think it's just all in the premise. Like I didn't find like I learned anything more than what I've just told you now through reading the novel. So yeah, I'd give it a miss. That said, it's won lots of prizes and stuff, so maybe it just wasn't for me, right? We didn't get on. One thing that I learned from reading this book would be that an atmospheric setting doesn't make something feel atmospheric. He goes to the zoo. He goes to this abandoned zoo because there's no animals anymore. At one point, and he just stays there and he's just reflective. And I feel like an abandoned zoo in a dystopian society where there's no animals and we're all cannibals should be like a really great setting for like atmosphere and stuff. But like I thought it was very boring, and he's just reflecting about he's like remembering stuff with his dad and stuff, and then he goes away, and then some stuff happens, and then on his way home he decides to go back to the zoo. And I remember just thinking, oh God, not the zoo again, we already did this. And he just goes there and thinks and goes on, and like, yeah, I didn't like the zoo. And for me, if you just say the words abandoned zoo, it already sounds like it's exciting. I can start thinking of interesting stories that could happen there. But yeah, this book ruined abandoned zoos for me, and I can't really forgive it for that. So unintentionally staying on the topic of food and society's horrific mistreatment of its most vulnerable members, the next book I read was The Crab Cannery Ship, or Kanikosen, by Kobayashi Takiji, translated by, oh my god, what was the name? Okay, I can't find the name now, but I'll put it here on the screen. So the Crab Cannery Ship is a hectic, nightmarish sea voyage in Japan in like the late 1920s. It was written in 1929, and it's contemporary, I think. And it's about a group of workers who are on a ship which is, there to catch crabs, and then they can the crabs after they catch them on the ship. Like every page is just crowded with all these stylistic devices and images that you just feel like you're being bombarded while you're reading it, which like mimics the relentless kind of trials that the sailors themselves are having to go through on the ship. It was not a good time, but unlike the last one, this was actually a really great book. And it's kind of interesting because in this one, like I would say, there's also not much nuance to the argument, just like in the last book, but it works so much better here because like that's kind of the point of the book. Like it's kind of like a communist manifesto as well as a novel about some guys on a boat kind of merged together. So it's not trying to be like incredibly nuanced about its arguments. It's like it's not a book about ideas. Instead, it's about like feelings. Like you feel the horror, you feel the injustice. It's not romanticized at all. It's like it's gritty. It's horrible. I did a reading blog of it, so I'll put it in one of these corners around here so you can have a look at that if you're interested. But yeah, I really loved it. I found it powerful. I found it convincing. I found it like exciting and what's the word? Like surprising, always surprising. There's loads of things that I just when it seemed like it was starting to get a little bit samey, it would throw in something else that caught me off guard. Like these depictions of homosexuality or homosexual acts, I should say. Like it's not, I think it's ambiguous whether they're consensual or not, but it's like, yeah, that's something I just didn't expect to read about in the kind of detail that's there for a book which was written in 1929. So that was very interesting. But anyway, yeah, one thing that I learned from this one is that it is possible to write like a political treatise of your honest beliefs and values and still make it into an interesting novel, which was not something that I thought would have been possible until I read this book. Then I read The Private Memoirs and Confessions of a Justified Sinner by James Hogg. I went into this thinking it was going to be a kind of fun, light, thrilling Gothic novel. And it is kind of in one sense just like a kind of a small Gothic novel, which is fun to read. I had a lot of fun reading it. But it's also just packed full. It's like a Jack-in-the-Box, like exploding with these kind of narrative tangents and big ideas and different kind of genre tropes which you don't think should be in the same place, but they all work together really well. I think they work together really well. It feels absolutely chaotic. Actually, yeah, kind of similar to the Crab Cannery Ship, not in the language itself, but in the kind of structure and the meat of what the book actually is. It's about a lot of things, but I guess like one of them easy story ways in is that it's about a guy who is in Scotland sometime after the Reformation, and he is a Calvinist, and he's sort of like on the extreme religious fundamentalist side of Calvinism, so that he is led to believe that he's sort of one of God's elect, which means that he's guaranteed a place in heaven. So it's sort of like, what would you do with your life if you knew you're going to go to heaven no matter what? And from that point of view, it's kind of like it ends up being a moral satire and stuff, but it's got so much more in it. I think it's like if Mark Twain and Nikolai Gogol were locked inside a Scottish castle and told they weren't allowed to leave until they'd written a scary story based on the Faust myth. And there has to be some gay stuff as well. It's pretty gay. Honestly, the queer subtext alone is enough reason to read this book. But yeah, it's just got so much going on. And I think that if you want to, like, even though it's quite short, if you want to get all that, you really have to put a lot of work into it. Like, even like the words of the title, like a justified sinner, like I had an understanding of what that meant, like someone who feels like, he is justified in his actions of sinning. But actually, the word justification has a really specific theological meaning, which you understand if you read the book. But if you really want to understand, you probably have to do some like wiki research to get like a good handle on things. So I think it is a book that It could be read for fun, but also if you really want to like get the most out of it, you have to give it a lot of time. It's not really something that I learned, but I think this novel kind of helped solidify something I've been thinking about lately, which is something that I really love and value in books, which is tonal shifting, or tonal like kind of variety, where it's like the way that a scene progresses could lead to emotions that you weren't expecting at all. Like it could begin kind of like foreboding and then end in a laugh, or it could like kind of be really sad and serious and then like kind of resolves that kind of melancholy feeling with something like really joyous and romantic, and just like kind of being able to meld what we usually see as separate genres and stuff like that. I don't know if there's a word for it, like tonal variation or something like that, but yeah, basically kind of setting you up in one way and then resolving the tensions of one kind of feeling with a totally different kind of feeling, and that leaves you kind of thinking like just making your emotions go all over the place. I think that's just something that I haven't read a lot of, or at least where it's successful, and I really love it when it works. I've read it in Gogol and I've read it in Ovid. He definitely did that in the Heroides, which I read recently, and also now James Hogg, of course. So that's a cool thing. Next up is Electra, and I talked about Electra a bit in one of my other videos. About like the best books of the year or something. So I'll link that as well. I think like I read 3 of my best books of the year in a row, which is like pretty cool. There's actually a surprising kind of connection I felt between Electra and the Private Memoirs of a Justified Sinner. You know how it is like when you finish one book and then you go to the next, and like some of the residue of that book just like kind of makes you notice things or feel things in a certain way when you get to the next book that you might not have picked up on otherwise. So in this case, it's Orestes. So the story, I should have said, the story is about these 2 siblings, Electra and Orestes, who are trying to get revenge on their mother and her lover, because they murdered their father. So they want to like basically kill their mother and her husband, the king and queen. And yeah, like Orestes has actually been commanded by Apollo to do this. So like it's not just his feelings, like a god has told him to do this. And yet he still isn't that happy about it. And he says like, even though, the god told me to do this, and so it must be right because Apollo told me to do this and he's an immortal, still I kind of feel it was wrong. And maybe it wasn't Apollo. Maybe it was like, a fiend that was taking the form of Apollo to, push me off the right path and stuff like that. And then Electra is like kind of, no, don't be ridiculous, of course it was Apollo. But yeah, that idea of being commanded by what should be a moral authority, or what seems to be a moral authority, but then having this kind of doubt about whether it really is good or not is a big part of Private Memoirs of a Justified Sinner and Confessions, because he, like, the kind of the villain of the piece is a character called Gil Martin, who meets the sinner and basically convinces him that all these horrible things that he's doing are moral, and that he should keep doing more and more horrible things, because actually they're the the most moral things to do. And the sinner is like, well, I guess this feels a bit wrong, but this guy obviously knows more than I do, so I guess I should do it. And so it's got a kind of comedic but also a tragic element, and I think that kind of comedy and tragedy mix is also here in Electra. Something I learned from this one is that I think very standard cliches and tropes can be done really well if they have characterization nested inside them, and like themes as well, like nested inside them. So for example, in this one, like Orestes, when he comes in on the scene, he sees Electra, and like she doesn't know, he knows it's her, but she doesn't know it's him, and they haven't seen each other in years. So he kind of says, like, to the audience, like, oh, let's pretend I'm not Orestes. So he goes up to her and starts asking her like who she is and why she's waiting for her brother and stuff. And so there's the kind of the irony, and we're laughing kind of at her expense, and that's like something that, like, it felt very Shakespearean to me, like one character pretending to be someone else so that they can talk about themselves to somebody else, and like kind of you get this comedic kind of almost kind of slapstick thing on the stage, and yeah, like that by itself is not like super appealing to me. I think it works if you see it, if you see people doing it. It's kind of a very like visual, physical thing. But the reason it works so well, like reading wise, is because that is the beginning of like the characterization of Orestes as someone who is not straightforward in his task, and he's like, like he's come back to, where is it, to Argos, or yeah, Argos, right? Or Anyway, he's come back, right, to do the murder, to murder his mom, right? But he, instead of just going up and doing it, he decides to first see his sister, and then when he sees his sister, he decides to pretend to be somebody else, just to like draw things out of it. And so like indirectly, all these little tropes are, you know, actually characterizing him as somebody who does not want to get things done. He's also got this big scar on his forehead, so he's basically like a prototype Harry Potter and a prototype Hamlet. So like honestly, Orestes isn't even the main character of this play, and like he's already like iconic. But anyway, yeah, the scar as a way of recognizing someone is like a trope in Greek mythology. So like with Odysseus, when he's disguised as an old man, his nurse finds the scar on his leg, and it's like, oh, this is the boar I remember, so you must be Odysseus, and blah blah blah. So yeah, having a scar that makes people see through your disguise is a trope, I think, and it's used like as a trope, so like the audience would be familiar. It's like, oh, he's got the scar, so she knows it's him from this incident. But it's not just for the fun kind of recognition moment for the audience in the theater. It's also got like, again, like this nested theme and characterization where they describe the hunting accident where he got the scar, and they say that like Electra was there and she was egging him on to like kind of kill this boar. And so he went to kill the boar, and he did kill the boar, but before he managed it, the boar like cut him across the head, and so obviously he suffered for it, and he's still marked by it permanently. And that's obviously like this massive foreshadowing and like encapsulating the situation that they're now in when it comes to the mother murder. So that was pretty great. Next up, we have A Children's Bible by Lydia Millett. In this book, there's a bunch of families, and they go to like some sort of estate. We're seeing things from the perspective of the children of the families, and they are quite odd in their relationships with each other, but especially when their relationships to the parents. They seem like kind of disgusted by them. The parents are kind of decadent. They're doing lots of drugs and drinking and having a great time. And they seem to also be kind of disassociated from their own children and being, you know, generally irresponsible people. And yeah, like it at the beginning, the sort of the disconnect between the two groups, the generational gap, is so odd that it kind of made me feel like maybe this is supposed to be in an alternate universe kind of thing. Like their behavior, just little other things about behavior creates this sort of uneasy atmosphere, which I thought was really well done. And then as it goes on, there's obviously like a connection between nature, which is different for the two generations as well, and the outside world. And we understand that it is basically our world, but like maybe a little bit in the future again, like maybe slightly dystopian, like just like dystopian light kind of feeling. And yeah, it's a book about climate change. It becomes quite obvious from the start. Like the writing style for me, like I said, it was kind of quite engaging at the beginning, but it felt like this mix between YA and literary fiction, which just didn't quite gel. So a lot of the sentences and decisions and character kind of motivations and actions and like interactions with each other was quite basic, and then that would be paired with like some sort of like contemplative symbolic stuff. Like there's loads of symbolism with the Bible, where like, you know, there's a flood, and then like it's and they have to get some animals, and they're bringing the animals into the house, and there's just loads of symbolism which I honestly really disliked. I thought it was exactly the kind of metaphor that I don't like in literature, where maybe it's just something was going over my head, but honestly it felt like it was for nothing. It was like just metaphor for the sake of having a metaphor, like, oh, it's like the Bible, and that bit's like Noah, and that bit's like Christ, and that, you know what I mean? Like just like kind of letting you make the connections between stories from the Old and New Testament and events that are happening in the novel, but without any real kind of like significance or like any good vibes between the two. Like I honestly don't know what was the point of all of that. Going back to what I was saying, like I felt like it was going for literary stuff and also going for kind of like a YA style, and it fell in the middle, and like it's a shame, because like I think if it had stayed more on the YA side of things, it would have been better. So like if it had made it like a kind of a bit more like interesting plot wise, for example, or fleshed out the characters a bit more, then it would have been better. There's also like a lot of stuff which happened which just didn't make sense. Like it made me ask, like, why are they behaving in this way? And, you know, like sometimes it worked in a way which made me kind of, you know, like interested, like I want to find out. But other times it honestly made me think like maybe this is a mistake or something. Like there's this one bit where there's a boy who they trap in a hole, and they leave him in the hole, and they just abandon him for like a few pages, and then like when he gets out of the hole, no one makes a big deal of it. And I couldn't tell if it was supposed to reflect that, this is like the mentality of these children and the adults as well. They're kind of like uncaring and they don't mind if someone lives or dies. And then the kid as well, like obviously doesn't seem to care if he kid lives or dies or something. But I felt like more like it was just like a bit sloppily written as well. Like the author didn't want to have time to show the consequences of this thing that had happened, and so it just, they got the boy out of the hole later on in the book and moved on. There were these like gaps in logic, and sometimes it felt like they were meant to be like, intentionally unsettling, and sometimes it just felt like they were kind of mistakes. Like that could have gotten picked up in editing or something. So yeah, unfortunately, it was very, very uneven for me. I did really like the generational divide, which was like a big part of the book. I thought like in lots of ways it kind of reflected, like contemporary society, and generational divides is something that I'm interested in, I think, when it comes to contemporary society. So I did really like that aspect of it. But there were bits of it as well that like kind of like felt wrong to me or a little bit off to me. Like the parents are the ones who are being kind of derided, and they're kind of interesting because they're all like liberal elites, I suppose you could say, like liberal in their values, and they're interested in art and music and architecture and stuff like that. They're very well off, well educated. They've got these nice big houses that they can stay in if if there's a climate disaster and whatever. But they're obviously like don't have a sense of responsibility. Instead, they've got like a kind of sense of hopelessness about where the world is, and that's why the kids distrust them. But the kids themselves also seem quite hopeless, and the kids themselves are just sort of like kind of practically picking up the pieces of a world which is already doomed. And yet like that didn't seem for me to represent like young people's attitude towards climate change. A lot of young people, I feel like, tend to be a lot more, if not necessarily hopeful, then like kind of actively involved and like kind of angry and like kind of pushing to change things than the young people in this novel. So I felt like this novel is the kind of the tone of hopelessness made it feel like it was more targeted towards this kind of older generation rather than the young people who would read it. Like that kind of tone of hopelessness, I feel like it didn't fit like the protagonists of the book. One final point, like I remember reading before somewhere that there's this kind of premise or like underlying strand of a lot of modern science fiction. I say modern, I mean like going back to H.G. Wells and stuff, so maybe just all science fiction, I don't know. But like this kind of idea of what if it happened to white people? So it's like, when the alien invasion comes, it's written in the same kind of ways that colonial practices are written, only it's happening to white people instead. So it's kind of like, in a way, it can make people, like it can make white people empathize more with the horrible, effects of colonialism, but also it's kind of a way of diffusing that fear and like kind of only making it, only making it valid if it happens to white people, you know what I mean? So like, I'm not doing a very good job of explaining it, but basically that kind of like, what if this happened to white people thing, I think was also really present in this book. Like, there's this bit where one of the main characters says like, we were refugees, and it's meant to be really serious, and like, they're all children of like these white privileged elites, and like that's obviously like part of the story. So it just kind of left a bad taste in my mouth, this idea that we're meant to think like, oh my god, they're refugees, whereas there's obviously so the refugee crises around the world are like such a huge thing, these humanitarian catastrophes which are happening right now, which in which like the refugees are overwhelmingly not white people, they're people of color. So like, I don't know, there's something kind of that just like rubbed me the wrong way about this kind of imagine these young white privileged children being refugees. I don't know, it felt a bit tasteless to me. I think there is like one person of color in the group, but yeah, like there's still the class issue is there. They're still the children of very wealthy people, even if they deny their parents and they don't get on with their parents and they've got a different mindset to their parents, they still have the same economic kind of privilege and the racial privileges of their parents. So I just felt like that wasn't addressed, maybe, or even it was used in a way which I didn't think worked so well. Oh yeah, and like near the end of the book, it turns into The Walking Dead, and that was just ridiculous. Something I learned from this one was that like it's a double-edged sword if you don't flesh out characters. Like it can be really interesting because it makes the reader kind of want to find out more about them if you give them like just certain details and leave big gaps. But also like at the end of the day, if you can completely lose your reader as well because the character just ends up being totally two-dimensional. So like knowing when to leave gaps and when not to leave gaps is probably something very difficult, I imagine. Next up is The Lonely Londoners by Sam Selvin. This book was a revelation. It's set just after World War II, when the United Kingdom was basically asking people from its colonies in the West Indies to come over and help like rebuild the country. So you had a big influx of poor working class black people into the country, and so it's like kind of like the like what we call now the Windrush generation, although they weren't called that at the time. Windrush being the name of the boat, one of the main boats, I think, that brought them over at the beginning. But anyway, so the story is from the point of view of, well, the main character is called Moses. Basically, Moses is someone who's, because he's been there a while, people who know him tell other people who are coming over to get in touch with him because he can help like sort something out for them, like, somewhere to live and a job to get, and where they can get food and clothes and all this stuff. So he's kind of like an unofficial welfare service officer, whereas like obviously he's not paid or anything for this. It's just like out of goodwill, and he's not very, like, he hasn't got a lot of goodwill. Like, he's always like kind of grumpy and kind of annoyed about having to do these things, but he does them anyway. So he's an interesting character in that way. And yeah, the book is like definitely like what you could call a picaresque novel, in that it's not like a straightforward story, but it's these just like kind of little episodes of like adventures that different characters have, and they're often like kind of showcasing maybe the underbelly of British society at the time, because a lot of these are like the worst jobs that people could get, or the ones that people that the people from the West Indies would be getting, and also like the more sort of like the precarious kind of life, but also the joy of life. Like, that's the thing. Like it's a book which is about these working class people who face horrible racism, and who have got are constantly being questioned by the society that has invited them in about like whether they belong or not, and they're like in the most precarious rung of that like society's social ladder, at the bottom, and yeah, it's just really lively and really fun, and there's like, it's just got this great sense of like propulsion that like that makes you go through it. It doesn't get morbid, it doesn't get morose, it's not self-pitying, and I think like that maybe that's one of the reasons actually that it was popular, because like it kind of masked a bit some of the difficulties of the time. It's not like a polemic, it's not like a like a call to arms like the Crab Cannery ship or something like that. It's just like kind of a fun adventure story. But through that fun adventure story, we get like a sense of what life was like for this first generation of people from the West Indies who came to the UK. The voice of this book is like one of the main things that stands out. It's written in like Pidgin English or like Creole, so like the spelling and the grammar is all very non-standard, and that like really helps to create this multicultural London. Like, so much of it felt to me like this is a book about London, rather than necessarily a book about the racial experience of being a West Indian in the Windrush generation in the 1950s in London. It's like, it doesn't have that kind of identitarian, I don't know, like focus that like we have now, I think, in the 21st century, about having to tell the story of a group. It feels far more like it's telling the story of London at this time, and it just happens to be following this group, this social group, and that I really appreciated, because it creates like a sense of place, rather than like London is the city of white people and these are like the black people who are in it. It's like, no, this is like, London is now a multicultural city. This is what London is now, and it's got good and it's got bad, and yeah, like a lot of it is just fun and playful, and like both the language and the adventures and the characters are all like really fun and playful. Like I said, it's not like self-pitying at all. Like a lot of the characters in fact are really not nice people and quite unpleasant, and like they break the law, and they cheat on their girlfriends, and they do all sorts of like kind of scams to get by, but there's also this kind of good-natured like attitude towards them, and their characters are just really fun to be around. It's definitely like a kind of a classic which I feel needs to be read more, maybe especially like for English schools and stuff like that. It feels like it deserves to be on the curriculum, especially because like the Windrush generation has recently come into politics a lot more because of stuff that's going on in the UK, which is ridiculous. So but yeah, not just this specific generation, but like just to speak to ideas about multiculturalism and about like immigration and stuff like that. I think it's like a really, really valuable novel. Something I learned from it, I don't know. it still wasn't like a perfect book for me. Like I think the whole picaresque kind of format of these like just like adventure episodes thing, it just maybe it's not something that I particularly like. Even though it was done really well here, I just think maybe as a form, it's not for me. So but that's kind of negative. I want to say a nice thing about this book because I liked it so much. So like maybe stream of consciousness, like it has a big stream of consciousness section towards the end, which was very surprising, and it was really great to read, and I normally don't like stream of consciousness, so I learned from this book that sometimes if it's done sparingly, I do really like stream of consciousness. Then I read another play, The Glass Menagerie by Tennessee Williams. This is about a family in the 1930s. They're not very happy. The mum is like this stereotypical faded Southern belle archetype. In fact, I think like this is maybe the play which kind of invented that archetype. Um, and yeah, so she's very delusional and like kind of clinging to these like kind of her past, her youth, and like kind of lost in the past kind of person. And the husband left, right? And then there's the son who works like to support the family in like a warehouse, Tom, and he's not happy with it. He wants to be a poet. He wants to go adventuring and do something with his life, but he's chained down by the family. And then finally there's the sister, or the daughter, who's called Laura, and she has a limp and she's very insecure and she's got like these kind of feelings of inferiority, and like she's basically just like kind of the old maid figure where she's going to be stuck in the house, like I guess turning into, well, she can't even turn into someone like her mother, right? Because she doesn't have a youthful past to fantasize about. She has other kinds of fantasies. She has a little glass figurine collection, which she sort of like is her fantasy world that she goes into, hence the name of the play. So yeah, I didn't really get on with this so well. Like the ending was really powerful. Like I was really surprised how much the ending got me. Because like kind of leading up to the ending, nothing really like kind of landed. I felt like the stage directions, like Tennessee Williams' voice, like interrupting to say like these detailed things about now a spasm like goes across his face as he looks in abject horror at this, and a small light like shows the curve of his pinky or something like that. It's like it's so like intrusive and minute and like kind of annoying. Like I felt annoyed. Like I can't imagine what a director would feel like putting on this kind of play. Like I mean if it was me, I would just ignore all that, because like seriously, like like back off, Tennessee Williams. It's like you wrote the thing but you don't have control over every little detail. But yeah, I guess that's just his style. Like it's not like there was anything that I had any particular complaint about. I think it's just that maybe the characters were a bit two-dimensional, especially the two women characters. Like I think watching it would be such a better experience than reading it. And I think this, more than any play that I've ever read, probably I felt that with this one. This would, because you wouldn't have those annoying stage directions for one. You just see the impact of them. And also there's like some visual stuff, like there's like a projection that's talked about, like that's going on, and like kind of strange modernisty experimental things. It's at the beginning, like it starts with Tom saying this is a memory play, and I think that like it works better if you imagine it, or at least for me, if I imagined it as like just Tom's memory. Like it's actually like all this that's happening is just Tom's world and his version of events and his memory, because that kind of explains why the women are a bit two-dimensional. And it kind of if the whole world is Tom's imagining of the world, then it's like a psychological portrait, and that would be actually way more interesting for me, given the way that things go in the story. But yeah, like a lot of the symbols as well were in, again, like that kind of high school metaphor style, I thought, where it was just like, you think, it's like a bridge from one thing to another. Like, oh yeah, this thing symbolizes his guilt, or that thing symbolizes her feelings of inferiority, or you know what I mean? It's like, I didn't feel like there was any depth really to a lot of the symbols, which was a shame. But yeah, the ending hit me so hard, like with the family stuff in it. What did I learn? I learned it's probably much better watching Tennessee Williams plays than reading them, maybe, if he always uses this kind of stage direction voice, because it felt to me like reading it like he's another character, which is ruining his own play. But yeah, that's just me. Next one is At Night All Blood is Black, and I just did a big review of that, so I'm not going to talk about it much. I'll just link that somewhere. You can have a look if you're interested. And yeah, it's a World War I novel about a Senegalese soldier who's fighting in the French army and going pretty crazy and chopping off a lot of hands. Next we have Normal People by Sally Rooney, and yeah, another one of my favorite books of the year. of last year, I should say. This one was, well, yeah, I talked about it again in one of those videos. It's about Marianne and Connell, and they're kind of growing up together in Ireland, and it's like kind of how how people affect each other. Like it's a story about a relationship. It's a book about a relationship rather than about two individual characters, and like how I think like internal forces and like kind of motivations and stuff are shaped by other people, like external forces, right? Especially like if it's somebody that you have a sort of intense emotional bond with, how they kind of like, you know, end up pushing and tugging at the little bits inside of you that will end up, you know, making a drastic impact on like how your life is going to unfold, and the choices that you make in your I guess in your, you know, like teens, late teens to early 20s years, like that whole kind of thing. And being a millennial, I guess, like I'm completely in awe of Sally Rooney's ability, especially to write the male psyche at that stage in life and at that time period. Like I felt very seen through a lot of what goes through Connell's mind and what goes through Marianne's mind. Not necessarily because like I've had similar experiences, but just like kind of the ways of processing events and like kind of yeah, a lot of kind of small insecurities and interactions and stuff like that felt like really like so incredibly true for me in a way that I haven't read anywhere else. So that was great. I did have some criticisms, like when I started it, it was really difficult for me to get into like what the whole book was, and the writing style. While like she's got this kind of like quite sparse, blunt style, which I think a lot of people like, but I don't really like. It reminded me of writers like Cormac McCarthy or Haruki Murakami, although I felt like it was less confident or like kind of stylized maybe than either of those two. And there's like these sometimes like the attention to like little details, like, you know, a character touches his nose, or like she rubs her palms together, and it's just like kind of these kind of like really minutiae of things that are going on, like in a scene, which just seem kind of like too easy to parody, like describing things which would normally be skimmed over to try and like, you know, like make them a little bit more pregnant with meaning, I think just doesn't work a lot of the time. Like having a character, you know, like she sit down, she stood up, she walked to the door, she put her hand on the doorknob and turned the doorknob and then pulled the door open, and then she walked through the door. It's like there's bits like that which I don't know, they just didn't really work for me at all. Also, like Haruki Murakami was the sex scenes. Like I've heard, like when I went into it, like maybe it's because of the TV show or something, but I had this kind of image that it was like a little bit sexy, or a bit risque or something. And I thought the sex scenes were so clinical and emotionless and like kind of like honestly a bit dull to read. And I'm not saying like they shouldn't have been there. It just felt very functional to me. You know what I mean? Like all the sex felt very perfunctory and functional. Another thing, like I feel like Sally Rooney has so much compassion for her characters and just shows so much tenderness to everyone in the book, which was amazing. Even, you know, like when they're doing kind of ridiculous things, or they're being quite dislikable as people. But because of that, Marianne's family, I think, like her mother and her brother, just aren't afforded like anywhere near that amount of tenderness. And I felt like it really like stood out for me, like because everybody else is, you know what I mean? They just seem like kind of like villains. And you know, like there are like tiny like justifications, or well, self-justifications maybe, or like hints at suffering that the characters have gone through, which is why they would be so horrible and nasty and evil. But they're so small and underdeveloped that you kind of think, why did you even need to have this here? Like, I don't know. I mean, maybe it's more likely that Sally Rooney actually just wanted to have some characters who are really rotten, you know, just like properly evil characters in her book, to create like, you know, some sort of antagonistic force in it, because like she's so compassionate to everyone else. Like it serves like the plot to have like a sense of danger, and you do feel like there's danger when you're around these people, which was done well. Because it's meant to be like an abusive situation when it comes to Marianne. But yeah, for me, it just didn't jar with the overall kind of themes in the book, and also the receptivity of Sally Rooney's writing to toxic behaviors, basically, and being like very open-hearted in its approach to very toxic behaviors. So something I learned was that I think you can write a really compelling love story without it being a romance. And like I feel like, yeah, you can write a love story which gets love in lots of different shades, which, you know, like kind of aren't necessarily clear or able to be easily defined by our social conventions of like the different kinds of loving relationships that you have in different spheres of your life. Like you can write a love story which describes love in a sort of like in the way that it insidiously kind of moves between social categories. I think maybe something like that, something like that is what I learned. And then finally, another Irish book I read, Lies by, I think it's pronounced Doreen Negrifa. I'm not sure about that, which was written in Irish and translated into English also by Doreen Negrifa. So it's hard for me to have a really strong opinion on this because I only read the English half of the book, and I feel like having a book of poems which is written in two languages by the same writer, like it feels like a lot, and it's called Lies as well, and it's being translated there, and like I understand that there's a lot of small changes, like even not like knowing Irish, I could see that there was like numbers, for example, like there's one poem where there's a number 9 or something, and in the Irish version it's the number 8. So maybe there's something about like the sound of the number which just works or better in one language or the other. But yeah, I understand that like I'm missing a lot of the book by only reading in English. And that said, like I did enjoy these poems, but they were kind of like just fine. They were like kind of like a solid 3-star read for me, where there was lots of really nice bits and lots of kind of yeah, I don't need that poem in my life kind of bits. But since it hasn't, nothing's really stuck with me. It was just like a nice poetry experience. I remember like before I read a first page of A Ghost in the Throat, which is the book which Doreen Negrifa is far more famous for. And it just didn't grab me at all. And so I didn't read the book because like I was thinking, oh, this is quite popular and like a new interesting Irish writer. So like let's see what it's about. And yeah, the first page just really didn't grab me, and I thought, nah, I won't. Maybe some other time, but maybe also just Doreen Negrifa's writing style isn't for me. So yeah, I can't really say I learned anything from this, except that sometimes maybe it's fine to just have a book of poems, which is just fine, because I absolutely don't regret reading it. I had a great time, and even if I don't remember anything about it or it didn't impact my life in a huge way, it's still like fun. I'm trying to find value, I think, these days in those kind of light, entertaining experiences, as well as the sort of the big, heavy literature, like wow, changed my life kind of experiences. Although the latter are the ones that I'm more interested in finding. Obviously, if I can find them, then that's great. More often than not, you don't find them. So I think it's important to not get frustrated or dissatisfied by finding stuff which is just fine. Okay, that took way longer than I thought it would. But here we are at the end of the list. So thank you so much for watching. Let me know if you've read any of these books, if you liked them, and if you didn't like them, just let's chat about it down in the comments. And I'll catch you in the next video. Bye bye.